you all for coming today. This is our second in the Student Scholar Series this year. We are proud to have Mercedes Wilson-Barthes present for us today in the second presentation. As you know, you heard me say many times, this series was instituted in order to give student scholarship that is been noted and worthy and honored by the faculty as worthy of publication, and their support to venture and their arguments before the faculty and guests in a professional conference style setting. So we're happy to continue this series that we've, I think this is the 13th, 14th year. Sometimes I lose track of how long we've been doing this, but we've had a long storied tradition, and many folks have gone on to publish their scholarship, and we're glad to have Mercedes join us today and to continue that legacy. Before I get going, I'm just going to introduce Mercedes in a minute, but I'd like to say first a few words about her respondent, Giovanna Hadley. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Ms. Hadley is an advisory Z client architect at IBM with a particular interest in Z systems. I'm sure they'll explain all of this to those of us for whom this is over our heads. But she works with her clients to develop their mainframe strategy for from security to DevOps. I hope I said that right. So I'm going to leave her. She'll clear me up on that later too, or the two of you will. Giovanna has one patent pending U.S. approval and one granted U.S. patent, and always looks forward to submitting more. We thank her for being with us today. Now for our student scholar, Mercedes Wilson-Barthes graduated from Kenyon College with a BA in political science and modern languages. She has a master's degree in human rights protection from the University of Alcalá in Spain. And before law school, she had a career in international development with Lutheran World Relief. Throughout her time at Catholic Law, she interned for the Honorable Zuberi Williams in the District Court of Maryland, the Public Justice Center as a Squire Patton Boggs Public Policy Fellow, the U.S. Agency for International Development Office of Inspector General, and the Government Accountability Office of General Counsel. She has also served as a student attorney in the Immigration and Refugee Advocacy Clinic. She became interested in data security through her work at Lutheran World Relief, which incorporated mobile banking into its livelihood programming in Africa. In this work, she became familiar with the US and European data privacy regulations, and a particular interest in ransomware began while living in Baltimore during the 2018-2019 ransomware attacks on city infrastructure. Additionally, while interning at the Public Justice Center in Baltimore in the summer of 2020, she saw the residual impact of the ransomware attacks on vulnerable communities, which was only further exacerbated by the pandemic. I'm going to now turn the floor over to the second of this year's student scholars, Mercedes Wilson-Barthes. The title of her presentation, Ransomware Attacks on City Governments Past, Present, and Future. Mercedes.
Thank you so much, Professor Harmon. So I'm just going to share my screen so that everybody can see the presentation. I hope that it will work. Can everybody see that okay? Great, great. So before I begin, thank you so much, Professor Harmon, for that introduction. And I'd really like to thank Giovanna Hadley for serving as my expert reader while writing the article last year, and for her expertise and guidance preparing this presentation. So thank you so much, Giovanna. As Professor Harmon mentioned, my interest in ransomware attacks really started in Baltimore City, living there during the attack. And when doing my research for the article, I became very interested in the fact that there was little legal scholarship from what I could find regarding ransomware attacks on cities. I know we see a lot in the news about ransomware attacks on the private sector, on hospitals, and increasingly in schools. and I found a lot of legal scholarship about those issues, but at that time, last year, not that much was written about cities. And I think that in a lot of ways, there is sometimes a lack of transparency or reporting about ransomware attacks, which I think contributes to a lot of the challenges that we're seeing. So before we get started, I wanted to share this quote from Robert Mueller when he was serving as the director of the FBI. This quote is from just about 10 years ago. This is some foreshadowing that he did at a cybersecurity conference when he said, but in the not too distant future, we anticipate that the cyber threat will pose the #1 threat to our country. And I think we see that coming true every day in our lives as we see more and more ransomware attacks in the news. So with that in mind, I wanted to go over the thesis of my article, which is that ransomware attacks on city and local governments have increased in recent years. And there's every indication that this phenomenon will only continue. Existing legislation at the state level is not currently adequate in many cases to protect cities from attacks and prepare them to recover. Additionally, the majority of cities do not have their own legislation protecting them from ransomware attacks. And while there is increased recognition of and attention to the vulnerability of cities to cyber attacks, there continues to exist opportunities to increase federally mandated protections. In summary, in order to safeguard the country and cities from the precarious future of rampant ransomware attacks, the federal government needs to take a leadership role to address this ever-expanding threat. And really in this presentation, I'm going to be looking at Baltimore City as kind of a case study in the vulnerability of cities and how legislation at a variety of levels could help to increase protection. And before we get kind of into the meat of the presentation, I wanted to review a few key terms that I think are helpful because I know I had different understandings of some of these terms when I kind of delved into this topic. So the first key word is ransomware. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which is kind of a watchdog government group, defines ransomware as a type of malicious software or malware designed to deny access to a computer system or data until a ransom is paid. So what that means is that what this looks like is an actor breaches a computer system, disables it, and promises to unlock it based on a payment of ransom. And at that time, the actor may unlock the data they took hostage so that the victim of the breach can access the data again. Of course, there's no guarantee that the data will be unlocked once the ransom is paid. So kind of with that in mind of how we're defining ransomware, I thought it would be helpful to look at what ransom payments look like kind of in this new world, because it's not necessarily the typical type of ransom that we think of. Ransom payments are largely requested by attackers in cryptocurrency. Sometimes they're requested in a different type of currency or sometimes even gift cards. But in 2019, 90% of ransomware payments were paid in Bitcoin, which is obviously the world's largest form of cryptocurrency. And Bitcoin is really the preferred method for ransom payments for cyber criminals because it largely allows payments to remain anonymous and untraceable. And the payment can also be made online easily and quickly. And moving on to the key term of hackers. So the word hacker is kind of in our common lexicon now, but there are a variety of different hackers. So a hacker is really someone who uses computers to gain unauthorized access to data. And a black hat hacker is really the kind of hacker that we all think about, kind of a bad hacker. So ransomware attacks are really largely perpetrated by what we think of as black hats. However, it is important to note that there is a large class of ethical hackers known as white hats. And white hats are employed by the government or the private sector to really identify vulnerabilities within cyber infrastructure. And then the government or the private sector actor can then act upon addressing these vulnerabilities that are identified by the white hats. and we'll talk a little bit more about them later on. So those are just a few of the key terms that I wanted to introduce before moving on. So just to give a little more background about the prevalence of cybersecurity, and more specifically, the prevalence of cybersecurity attacks on state and local governments. The World Economic Forum in 2020 highlighted cyber attacks, which is the same thing as ransomware attacks, to be one of the top risks in 2020. So if we think back to that quote that I offered at the beginning of the presentation from Mr. Mueller, that cyber attacks would be the #1 threat, we really see that his kind of prescient comment is coming to fruition. He said it would be the #1 attack, and it really has become one of the #1 threats that we have. The World Economic Forum noted that the US fell victim to far more significant cyber attacks than any other country. And the World Economic Forum defines significant cyber attack as any attack that causes more than $1 million in damages. So that kind of gives us the picture of what a huge threat cyber attacks are. But more specifically, state and local governments were victim to 70% of all ransomware attacks in the US of 2019. So I think that really highlights the huge vulnerabilities that cities face to ransomware attacks. So as I mentioned, I'm going to be looking at Baltimore City as a case study in a ransomware attack, and then looking at related legislation. But I also wanted to provide an overview of why cities are particularly vulnerable to ransomware attacks and what it looks like when they're faced with a dilemma of paying ransomware. So the first issue that makes cities so particularly vulnerable is their infrastructure. Cities often have outdated cyber infrastructure, which leaves them open to attacks in the face of a variety of crimes, cyber threats, and these problems are often not prioritized by city officials. Some experts speculate that cities are so uniquely vulnerable in comparison to companies, for example, because they may lack the resources and skilled staff that are necessary to combat cyber predators. And then, of course, there's the general legislative process that cities have to navigate. So unlike the private sector, cities cannot be as nimble in allocating budget to protecting themselves against cyber threats. So those are just a few of the main factors why cities are so incredibly vulnerable to ransomware attacks. Another huge issue that all cities and really all organizations face when they're a victim of a ransomware attack is whether or not to pay the ransom. Now, while the FBI does advise that cities and the private sector do not pay ransom in response to a ransomware attack because it could only further exacerbate the problem or encourage future hackers, it is mostly not illegal to pay a ransom unless the attackers are on one of the government's kind of the OFAC do not pay list. So at this point, it is largely up to the discretion of city governments whether or not to pay. So for example, of the 55 reported attacks in 2018 on municipal governments, and again, as I mentioned, the data that I'm using is what has been reported, but just in general, there is kind of oftentimes some secrecy around ransomware attacks because governments or private sector actors may not want to admit that their information, their data has been compromised. So of the 55 reported attacks, only 2 town governments and 1 county government are known to have paid their ransom. And it should also be noted that it's not clear that of these 2 towns and 1 county government that paid the ransom, it's not clear if they actually got their data back or not. So it's not really clear what the cost-benefit analysis was for them to pay the ransom. So looking now at the private sector, because we often have a little more data about the private sector experience with ransomware attacks, only 26% of ransomware-affected companies that paid their ransom actually received their ransom files returned. So that's a quarter of the companies that were attacked and paid the ransom received their files back. And then additionally, paying the ransom certainly does not protect organizations from future attacks, as 73% of organizations that paid ransom were attacked again. So oftentimes hackers can leave malware on a computer and kind of reactivate it later on. So that's just kind of an overview of some of the vulnerabilities and patterns in ransom that we see in cities generally. Now I wanted to move on to the specific case study of Baltimore, because I think it follows a trajectory of many small to mid-sized cities in terms of ransomware attacks. And small to mid-sized cities are particularly vulnerable because of their limited resources, as opposed to a larger city. So looking at the history of vulnerability to ransomware attacks in Baltimore City, as Professor Harmon mentioned, in 2018, Baltimore City was the victim of an initial ransomware attack, which immobilized the city's 911 services and emergency dispatch system for 17 hours. So this was an initial ransomware attack, and we're going to be talking about a much larger one that took place the next year. So prior to the 2019 attack, which I'm going to focus on, the Department of Homeland Security completed a risk assessment that identified significant vulnerabilities in the city's cyber infrastructure, but Baltimore City failed to address these vulnerabilities and did not complete the necessary software updates. So after that assessment, unfortunately, on May 7th, 2019, Baltimore City experienced one of the largest ransomware attacks in US history at that time. The attackers required a ransom of 13 Bitcoins, which is the equivalent of about $100,000 at that time. Baltimore City kind of did a thorough analysis as far as whether or not to pay the ransom and decided not to pay the ransom. The attackers threatened to increase the ransom if it was not paid within 4 days. And they said that all the data would be lost if it was not paid within 10 days. There's also speculation that some sensitive data that was released on Twitter was released by the hackers. The actual impact of the cost of the cyber attack on Baltimore City may never be fully known, but the estimates that I have read place it around 18 million. So this amount consists of 10 million in IT expenses and 8 million in lost or delayed revenue. And in order to cover these costs, and other city services have been very negatively impacted, and the city has had to move about 6 million from the public service and parks budget towards these expenses. The ransomware attack took down voicemail, email, parking database, a system used to pay for water and other public services, property taxes, and other vehicle citations. And despite warnings in the ransomware note not to alert the FBI, the city also immediately reported the attack to the FBI requesting their help. So that's kind of what the attack looked like. And just to go into a little more specifics about what the repercussions for the city were. The attack held approximately 10,000 government computers hostage, and this resulted in 7,000 city employees being unable to access the network. It also had a significant impact on the real estate market. Over 1,500 home sales were delayed because so many real estate systems were disabled due to the hack. And this resulted in a decrease in home sales by 18% in 2019, which is pretty significant given the already vulnerable economy within Baltimore City. And then to look a little bit more at the city services, after the attack, the water bills for 400,000 customers in Baltimore City were delayed until August 2019. So Baltimore City has a population around 600,000. So to impact delivery of basic public water and sewer services for 400,000 people is pretty significant. So by the time residents received their water bills in August, the bills were hundreds and hundreds of dollars. As Professor Harmon mentioned, I worked at the Public Justice Center in Baltimore City in the summer between my 1L and 2L years. And the Public Justice Center is an organization that addresses the needs of communities living in poverty through direct representation and legislative advocacy. And I had the opportunity to support some housing issues, and I really saw firsthand the impact of these incredibly large water bills on communities living in poverty that was further compounded by the impact of the financial detriment of the COVID epidemic. I think it's just really important to think about the real life impact these ransomware attacks can have on regular people. And now looking at how Baltimore City tried to respond to this attack. One way was to invest $20 million in cyber insurance to help protect from future attacks. And this was a very lengthy process, and they interviewed 17 different carriers, and in the end invested in 2 separate cyber insurance companies. Baltimore City also passed legislation to create a $10 million fund for ransomware response and recovery, created a coordination body within the government, and there was also legislation proposed at the state level to make the possession and use of ransomware a misdemeanor crime. But that legislation was unfortunately unsuccessful. It was introduced in January 2020. So that kind of wraps up the overview of the case study of Baltimore City. Now I wanted to look at some specific examples of city, state, and federal legislation to get an idea of how other ways that Baltimore City could be protecting itself and look at what recommendations could come out of it. So Baltimore City is really one of the few cities right now that has legislation at the city level to protect itself from ransomware attacks. There is, however, a variety of state level legislation, and I'll be looking at that more specifically. But in February 2020, there were 29 states that had legislation that required state government agencies to implement security measures to protect their data. And certain states like California, Connecticut, Michigan, Texas, and Wyoming had passed legislation that actually criminalized ransomware. Some state governments do focus on protecting municipal governments from ransomware attacks, and some states do not see it within their purview, and some states simply don't have the resources. A variety of states have introduced additional legislation to criminalize ransomware. However, I think the trend is because of the COVID epidemic, a lot of legislation has been stalled. However, some of the legislation does include a component which requires reporting by state governments within a certain period of time. And then just to give an example of federal level legislation, there really is a large variety of legislation at the federal level. However, the majority is really focused on the private sector and also includes voluntary participation as opposed to mandating participation. So one important example is the May 2021 executive order from President Biden. And this was issued in part in response to the pipeline attack. And it directed the Commerce Department to craft cybersecurity standards for companies that sell software services to the federal government. And so that's kind of in response to new models of ransomware attacks. The Department of State has created a reward of $10 million for information about hackers because it is so difficult to kind of track down hackers because of this anonymous payment system. And then, of course, there's stopransomware.org, which is an information platform that sets standards and shares best practices regarding protecting from ransomware attacks. So those are a few ideas of the state and federal level legislation that exists in general. But I wanted to look more specifically at some of the state legislation that exists elsewhere throughout the country that could have benefited Baltimore City if it had been in existence in Maryland at the time of the attack. So one of these would be utilization of an emergency declaration. So Louisiana actually has an emergency support function, which is a type of legislation that really could have benefited Baltimore City. One of the challenges that Baltimore faced in responding to the attack was the lack of ability to elevate the ransomware attack to the level of an emergency. And such capacity really have helped them to access state and federal support. And this Louisiana emergency support function really allows Louisiana government to declare an emergency after a ransomware attack and then mobilize a team of experts to provide support. And as I mentioned, this type of facility would have really helped Baltimore City to access immediate support as in other emergencies. And then looking at accessing additional resources, one relevant state legislation that I looked at was Texas House Bill 3834. At the time of the attack, like so many mid-sized cities, Baltimore City lacked the resources to have the necessary city infrastructure, technology training, cyber insurance, and response mechanism. And Texas House Bill 3834 requires cybersecurity training for government employees and contractors, as well as identifying appropriate training for these stakeholders. And this type of program would have really helped train and prepare Baltimore City employees to be better prepared for this type of attack. Another kind of bucket of the type of support that would have benefited Baltimore City would be what we see in Wyoming bills SF 35 and SF 36. Wyoming was actually the first state to criminalize ransomware, and then they further enacted additional legislation which requires perpetrators of ransomware attacks to update clients and patients whose personal data has been compromised. And I think they were specifically looking at hospitals in the private sector, but just this requirement of information sharing is incredibly valuable. If Maryland had had similar legislation in place, or if it had existed at the federal level, Baltimore may have been aware of this type of malware that attacked them. So actually, Greenville, North Carolina was attacked by this type of malware called Robin Hood in April of 2019. So 1 month before Baltimore had been attacked. So if Baltimore had been aware of this attack, they may have been able to prepare themselves or learn from the experience of Greenville, North Carolina, at least. And kind of the last bucket of relevant state legislation that I looked at elsewhere is cyber insurance. This is really in large part an unregulated area. And the only state that I saw who has current regulation is New York State, which developed a cyber insurance risk framework, which really looked at created recommendations to mitigate risk when actors are purchasing cyber insurance. And as I mentioned, Baltimore had to look at 17 different cyber insurance companies and ended up selecting 2 and really dedicated a lot of resources to this. So some kind of state regulatory system would greatly have helped Baltimore City to be prepared to purchase the correct type of cyber insurance. And moving on to my final slide, looking at federal recommendations. The first, so I really would recommend that these kind of successful legislation that we see at the state level be highlighted and brought to the federal level so that participation in these government programs is required instead of voluntary, to really create systems of scale to promote the effective protection of cities and states. So my first recommendation regarding emergency declarations is to ensure that cities are better supported in their response to cyber attacks. And as part of that, amend the definition of emergency to include ransomware attacks, so that when cities or states declare an emergency in response to a ransomware attack, they're able to access the support that they need. And we really saw in response to COVID-19 that the definition of emergency was significantly expanded in many places, and kind of continuing with this model of amending the definition of emergency to include ransomware attacks. Additionally, resources. Obviously, resources are always a problem for cities and state governments. So as part of this, my recommendation would be for a federal program that issues grants to cities, specifically deploying technical experts to evaluate and protect cyber infrastructure. And as part of this, utilizing white hats or those ethical hackers to help identify and address weaknesses in the system. My next recommendation falls under the category of information sharing. There are already a lot of excellent information sharing platforms that the federal government has established, for example, the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, or the Multi-State Information Sharing and Analysis Center at the Center of Internet Security. However, many of these programs are voluntary, and I think some kind of mandated program that would require state and city actors to share information is the only way to create sustainable protection. And my last recommendation is around the regulation of cyber insurance. As this is a largely unregulated area, there are so many opportunities for cities to be taken advantage of. And only with federal government oversight will protection be granted. So as I mentioned, while ransomware attacks will likely continue to target city governments, finding ways to increase the security of cities and its citizens will require a more holistic and innovative approach from actors at the federal, state, and local level. And in particular, the federal government needs to take a leadership role to address this ever-expanding threat. Thank you all so much.
Thank you, Mercedes. I'll now ask Ms. Hadley if you will conduct a response. What are your questions for Mercedes?
Great job, Mercedes. So you made a couple great points. One of them, you talked quite a bit about criminalizing ransomware. Is this something Maryland has thought about implementing at the state level? And how do you think this impacts our ethical hackers? That's one of the tools they use.
So the Maryland legislation introduced in 2020 was not successful. It was introduced in January of 2020, and I think in part because the COVID pandemic hit so soon thereafter, the legislation did not get the attention that it deserved, but also that legislation did not address protecting ethical hackers. Currently, there really is no legislation that protects ethical hackers. So they're really put at a great risk when their services are employed. The Department of Defense uses ethical hackers. They have attributed saving more than $65 million because ethical hackers have identified weaknesses that they were then able to address. Apple uses ethical hackers, but ethical hackers are always putting themselves at a great risk when they employ their services because they're technically breaking the law because they're hacking a system. There was a recent Supreme Court decision from last year, Van Buren versus the US government. And that was a case where a police officer in Georgia hacked into his own police system to access unauthorized data related to parking information that somebody had paid him to get. The Supreme Court found that in this particular case, it was not an abuse of his power because he initially did have access to that system. So that decision, even though he initially had access to that system, he was using it for an unauthorized reason, but the Supreme Court still found that he had not violated the law. He had not violated the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. So that decision is seen as kind of opening the door for helping to protect ethical hackers. But technically, there's no law on the books protecting their important work.
Fantastic. And then the other question I had for you was, you talked about cyber insurance. And since it's such a new and upcoming thing, is there any cases around it?
There was a recent decision in New Jersey courts. It was Merck Pharmaceutical Company won a case against a number of insurance providers regarding cyber attacks that took place in 2017 and 2018. And the insurance providers claimed that they were not required to pay for the cyber attack because there was language in the contract that said that they did not have to pay in a time of war, in an act of war. And so they were claiming that because the ransomware attacks were arguably perpetrated by Russia, that this was an act of war. And the court found in favor of Merck and said that in the contract, acts of war are really considered to be traditional acts of war that might involve combat. But I think that this speaks to really interesting issues about who's perpetrating ransomware attacks and how can actors really protect themselves when it's largely unknown who's perpetrating these acts.
Thank you, Mercedes. That's all I had, Harmon.
Thank you, Ms. Hadley. And any questions from the audience while people are thinking about this? Let me ask the two of you, maybe you can help me with this. What percentage of hackers, and this would be black hat hackers, are ever caught? I mean, can you give me a rough estimate about that? I mean, is it like shockingly low? And if they do find them, and you can tell me that, how are they able to do it?
Well, I can take a stab at trying to answer that. It's my understanding that it's very, very low. And part of that, I think, is because of this dichotomy as to whether or not it's state actors or non-state actors who are perpetrating this attack. President Biden has really prioritized collaboration with other countries, with other international actors, in kind of bringing folks to justice who are perpetrating these attacks. However, it becomes incredibly complicated when we're talking about individuals that may or may not be connected to a government of another country. It becomes increasingly difficult to prosecute those actors. And then, of course, because the attacks are often done anonymously and payment is requested anonymously, it can be incredibly difficult to bring people to justice. I don't know, Giovanna, if you have anything to add.
No, you're spot on. The big thing is a lot of our legislation hasn't caught up to the world of the internet. So even just from a legal perspective, we can't prosecute necessarily because we don't have something to prosecute against. There's no crime that's been committed. The definition has not been implemented into our laws.
Has there ever been a famous, and I'm gonna go to Cara and Kathy here just a second. Has there been a famous case where somebody was caught, and how did they do it?
You know, I was thinking about preparing an answer to that question and I didn't get around to doing that, but I can tell you that there is an interesting case where they caught white hackers. It was MIT students who as a project were trying to identify vulnerabilities in the transportation system in Boston. Mm-hmm. Identified those vulnerabilities and they were arrested. But then because of their skills, the charges were dropped and they were hired to help address the vulnerabilities in those systems. So I'm going to have to get back to you, Professor Harmon, on what it looks like to bring people to justice, but it is incredibly difficult, I'm afraid.
Cora, would you go next and then Kathy after her?
Sure. Thank you for this, Mercedes. This was really interesting. And I think that MIT example you just gave sounds like an interesting screenplay. There's a screenplay in there somewhere. So 2 questions. One is, I just had a hard time understanding the Baltimore City example. Did the city, in fact, end up paying ever?
No, they did not pay.
Okay.
They did
I just
not
wanted
pay.
to clarify. Okay, so they did not pay. And that, I guess, I had 2 questions. So one is, you know, they don't pay, yet they suffer tremendous economic harm. But it sounds like, based on what your talk, that what's the, I guess my first question is, what's the incentive to pay, right? Because it sounds like the hackers will come back, right? It's just like any hostage situation. Like, they'll always come back for more if you pay, and you're going to suffer the economic harm anyway in terms of delay and, you know, locked data and so forth. So that was question number 1, is like, who plays ball with hackers and why? And then the second question I had is, I hear your call for legislation, and it sounded like a bill did not come out in Maryland to criminalize ransomware. But it strikes me, based on what you just said a moment ago, that it's not a question of inappropriate legislation or crimes on the books. It's just that you can't find the crime. They can't find the criminals.
Yes, those are excellent points. And just to speak to your first point about what's the benefit to pay the ransom. So looking at those three instances of city and county governments in 2018 that did pay the ransom, they didn't get their data back. In those particular cases, it was a few years ago, and they did have cyber insurance, and they were able to negotiate the ransom down. So one of the cities was in Florida, and I think they negotiated the ransom down from $750,000 to $500,000. And I think at that time, the cyber insurance may have helped to pay the ransom. However, as cyber insurance becomes more sophisticated, it's largely not becoming practice for the cyber insurance to help pay the ransom. I think that is one area that will be more easily regulated. And so I guess when going to the regulation piece, when I'm calling for more regulation, it's really to help prepare and protect cities rather than prosecuting the criminals, I guess, is my focus. But I think also as a big part of the legislation is that all of these cities or towns are looking at their current ransomware attack kind of on a one-off case. They're dealing with the information that they had in front of them. It took Baltimore City a long time to make the determination whether or not to pay the ransom. And that was time that they really lost from protecting their systems. So I guess that's where I was going with that.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Kathy?
I also have a couple of questions. You several times referred to the cyber insurance as something that would protect the city from attack, but it doesn't protect the city from attack, right? It just provides what, compensation, partial compensation for some of their economic losses?
It could. It's such an expanding area. There's also certain types of cyber insurance that have standards before you can even purchase the cyber insurance. So I think it's possible if Baltimore City had engaged in cyber insurance earlier on, they may have realized where they were and where they needed to be. Because when they received that report from the Department of Homeland Security, there were a lot of cities that received similar reports that they needed to patch their systems, but there wasn't this kind of impetus or this push to do so. And systems like cyber insurance may have helped to fill that gap.
This is a question that I do not know the answer to. So I'm just putting it out there, something you might want to think about. Insurance in general is regulated by the states and not by the federal government. So what would make cyber insurance different in that, so that it would permit your recommendation for the federal government to regulate it?
Thinking of this Merck example of how the insurance companies tried to deny the insurance claim because of the act of war situation. I think that just because the issue here is so much the interface between state and city with international actors, that it really calls for bringing in the federal government, because it's bringing in additional international actors that states and cities may not traditionally be engaged with.
Okay, one more. This is more of a comment than a question. And I think you had addressed it a few minutes ago. It sounds to me like you think the answer is resources and technology to protect against burglar alarms, let's say, rather than legislation that would assist in prosecuting criminals that are hard to identify. Is that right?
I guess I don't know that it's either or, but more than anything else, I think information sharing is really key, because all of these places are having to address what they know, what they're finding out at that moment. And so as I mentioned, the Robin Hood type of malware that was used, if that information had been shared, if other places had been required to share that information, Baltimore City may have been better prepared. I always think preparedness, any investment in preparedness is more efficient than response. But I'll be honest, I did not focus as much on the prosecution aspect.
And finally, I think Catherine Kyoto, I hope I probably butchered your name, but you can correct me.
No, not at all. Thank you. Mercedes, thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. Just to sort of wrap it up, I'm curious if you have thoughts on what you think will be sort of the next large sectors or institutions that might be targeted by ransomware attacks.
I don't really know. It seems that ransomware attacks seem to be focused on areas that are most vulnerable. So I think during the pandemic, I think we saw an increase on attacks on schools, potentially because there was an increase in online engagement of schools. I think more than anything else, we're seeing innovative approaches used by attack by hackers to access different vulnerable institutions. So just as President Biden's executive order addressed creating standards for vendors that are engaging with the US government, that's something that we're seeing more and more. So maybe not potentially new targets, but different types of ways and methods that hackers are finding to attack existing organizations. So going through vendors like they did to attack USAID, they went through Constant Contact because it was a system that had lower, perhaps potentially lower standards for data security.
Is it true, final question, is it true that the ransom is proportionally higher depending on the information that is more, depending on how dangerous the information would be that is being released, or how, if you've got more that I'm willing to threaten, I will share, I can ask more money? Is that part?
I think it could be, and Giovanna, please step in for any of these questions. I think it could be. I think it in part depends on what the motivation of the hackers are. From my research, it seems like there could be a variety of motivations. Perhaps to be able to even test if a hacker could hack into a system. And of course, the security of the data. But it really depends. I know in New Orleans, when it was hacked, the hackers didn't even ask for a ransom. They just attacked the data, and there was no opportunity. But it certainly makes sense to me what you're proposing. But I think there's such an illogical approach sometimes to these hacks that it's difficult to say.
Yeah, it's hard to profile how this would go. Anybody else with any questions for John Hadley or Mercedes? Carl, one more question. Oh, Carl.
No, I was just clapping.
Clapping.
I wasn't raising my hand. I was just digitally clapping.
Well, horizontal hands instead of a thumbs up. I see. Okay, thank you. Well, this was fantastic, and obviously this is something that is a whole field that you will only be needed more in because this is never going to go anywhere. This is a huge part of the future. Sadly, it is, and the responses to it are going to be many and manifold. And thank you for your interest in it, and for Ms. Hadley for being with us today. A wonderful presentation. I really think this shows the quality of the scholarship we have here. Thank you both, Mercedes and John Hadley, for joining us. If you all will come back, our last presentation will be on March the 22nd. Carrie O'Donnell will be speaking in favor of regulating medicated assisted treatment for the treatment of telemedical treatment of opioid use disorders. So many of these things involve internet, cyberspace, that kind of thing this year. So very topical. And thank you all for joining us. Come back in March. Goodbye.
Thank you.